In the winter of 1944, the Great Britain that awaited German prisoners of war was a land of paradox. To the men arriving in cattle trucks and buses, it was the territory of the total enemy, the target of the Luftwaffe and the recipient of the V-2 rockets. Yet, for thousands of these men, the rolling hills and windswept moors of Yorkshire would become something they never expected, a sanctuary. History often focuses on the brutality of captivity, but the story of the POW camps in the north of England, specifically sites like Lodge Moor near Sheffield or Eden Camp near Malton, reveals a more complex human narrative. It is a story of how the bleak Yorkshire landscape, combined with the pragmatism of British administration and the kindness of local villagers, led many German soldiers to describe their time in captivity not as a sentence, but as heaven. The journey to Yorkshire usually began in the muddy chaos of the front lines in France or Italy. For many German soldiers, the transition from the terrifying violence of the battlefield to the relative silence of the English countryside was a psychological shock. Camp 17 at Lodge Moor was one of the largest. At its peak, it held over 11,000 prisoners. Upon arrival, the Germans were stripped of their military cohesion. They were processed, deloused, and given uniforms. Often surplus British gear dyed a distinct chocolate brown or marked with large, circular patches to identify them as prisoners. Initially, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. The British guards were often veterans of the First World War or men unfit for frontline service, while the prisoners were a mix of die-hard Nazis and disillusioned conscripts. However, the physical reality of the camp began to soften the edges of hostility. Unlike the scorched earth of the Eastern Front or the starvation-level rations back in a collapsing Germany, the British adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention. There was bread, there was tea, and, most importantly, there was a sense of order that suggested the war, for them at least, was over. By 1945, Britain was facing a desperate labor shortage. With millions of British men overseas, the nation's food security rested on the shoulders of the Women's Land Army and, increasingly, the prisoners of war. The heaven that the prisoners described was often found in the fields. Groups of Germans were bussed out daily to local farms across the West and North Ridings. They cleared drainage ditches, harvested potatoes, and tended to livestock. For a soldier who had spent years in a cramped U-boat or a frozen trench, the act of manual labor in the fresh Yorkshire air was transformative. The relationship between the farmers and the prisoners was a fascinating exercise in human necessity. Initially, farmers were warned not to speak to the Huns, but as the months passed, the Germans became essential members of the rural community. They were hardworking, disciplined, and often shared a common agricultural language with the Yorkshire locals. It was in these muddy fields that the propaganda of the enemy began to dissolve, replaced by the shared struggle of the harvest. The British authorities realized early on that a bored prisoner was a dangerous one. Consequently, they encouraged a vibrant cultural life within the camps. This is where the term heaven truly began to take root in the prisoners' diaries. At Eden Camp, the prisoners organized orchestras using instruments donated by the Red Cross or purchased through a camp canteen system. They staged plays, often involving elaborate costumes made from old blankets and discarded packaging. There were libraries stocked with English and German literature, and even camp universities where educated officers taught mathematics, languages, and trades to the younger conscripts. Perhaps the most significant element of this heaven was the food. While Britain was under strict rationing, the prisoners received the same caloric intake as British garrison troops. To a German soldier who had been living on sawdust bread and watery soup in the final months of the Rick, the sight of British white bread and the occasional ration of jam was nothing short of miraculous. Though the war ended in May 1945, many German POWs were not repatriated until 1947 or 1948. This delayed return initially caused resentment, but it led to the most heart-warming chapter of the Yorkshire story. In 1946, the British government lifted the ban on fraternization. For the first time, prisoners could be invited into British homes. That Christmas, Hundreds of Yorkshire families, many of whom had lost sons or husbands to the German army, opened their doors to the men in the brown uniforms. It was an extraordinary display of forgiveness. German soldiers sat at Yorkshire dining tables, shared meager Christmas rations, and played with the children of their former enemies. They carved wooden toys for the kids, trinkets that are still kept in many Yorkshire attics today. This sense of belonging, of being treated as a human being rather than a number, solidified the heaven narrative. Not all prisoners were treated equally. The British classified them into three categories: black, hardline Nazis; gray, uncertain; and white, anti-Nazis or low risk. The white prisoners enjoyed the most freedom, often walking to the local pubs or shops unaccompanied. When the time finally came for repatriation, many Germans found they didn't want to leave. They had fallen in love, not just with the landscape, but with the people. It is estimated that several thousand German POWs chose to stay in Britain after the war. They married local women, raised families, and became integral parts of the Yorkshire fabric. They traded the Iron Cross for the Yorkshire Rose. They became bakers, mechanics, and farmers in the very towns they were once sent to conquer. The story of the German POWs in Yorkshire is a reminder that even in the darkest epochs of human history, empathy can bridge the widest chasms. The heaven they described wasn't found in luxury, but in the simple dignity of a fair day's work, a warm meal, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Today, places like Eating Camp serve as museums, preserved not as monuments to victory, but as witnesses to this shared history. The huts still stand, the wind still sweeps across the moors, and the echoes of those German voices remain, reminding us that sometimes the greatest victories of war are the ones where the fighting stops and the healing begins.